No matter if you're playing Pathfinder or Shadowdark, OSE or Tales of the Valiant, Daggerheart or Drawsteel, the name of the game is Dungeons. And in this video, I conceptualize the idea of dungeons in the terms of nodes and connectors. And if you're not familiar with that idea, you can go watch my video called Everything's a Dungeon. So I expand on that everything's a dungeon concept by taking the idea that essentially, game design-wise, rooms and hallways translate into the concept of nodes and connectors. And once you make that leap with your imagination, you can conceptualize any adventure design in these terms. Then using those terms, you can take John For's 5-room dungeon design or my 6-room dungeon design, another video that I made. Then you can practice these concepts and create an endless amount of dungeons with these same simple concepts, but never making a dungeon feel the same as the last dungeon. Now, if you're already familiar with what a 5-room dungeon is, skip to this timestamp right here. Otherwise, stay tuned and I'll explain 5-room dungeons and then we'll elaborate from there. Now, if you haven't heard of the 5-room dungeon design, it comes from John For, who wrote in his blog, Role Playing Tips blog here, this is his page, he wrote this 5-room dungeon format. And you can actually he has a book, you can download it for free. All you have to do is, I think, sign up for his mailing list, and you get the free book about his 5-room dungeon design. But basically, if you haven't heard about 5-room dungeon design before, it's got 5 different rooms that don't have to be literally rooms. This could be a forest with 5 locations in the forest. It could be a castle. It could be inside of town, right? It could be a section of town, and you have 5 different buildings in that section of town that are relevant to your story. That makes a 5-room dungeon. But essentially, you have the entrance or guardian. This is basically just kind of a brutish battle, usually. It's just a fight. Typically, the guardian is the idea that it's a barrier to get into the dungeon. It's something preventing you from getting in. If this was a forest, maybe the hag has set up scarecrows to mark her territory, and those scarecrows come alive and attack you. If it's in the city, maybe this is the town guard, right? The town guard barracks is in this section of the city. So there's a brute force that's going to come get you if you mess around in the city. So, there's a lot of different ways to theme your 5-room dungeons. Room 2 is puzzle or role play. If we're using that city example, maybe there's an important NPC that lives in this section of the city, and he lives near those guards, and so he might be up to no good, but maybe he pays off those guards to get away with the things he gets away with. So the players have to come and interact with this guy and deal with him, but they can't just outright attack him because the guardians, right? The guards, the city guards. Room 3 is the trick or setback. This can be like an environmental challenge, some sort of hazard. Maybe in the city there's a group of ruffians or cultists that have their own intentions, and that's a barrier, right, to anybody trying to interact in that section of the city. Maybe you have to deal with the cultists once you come into that section of the city. Might not be a combat, but it could be the cultists kind of harass you and try to evangelize you and make you join their cult. So it's just like a setback. It's a nuisance. It's something in the way of what you're trying to accomplish. And it could, in an actual dungeon format, your setback or trick could be traps, right? It could actually be a series of traps along a long hallway or something like that. Room 4 is your climax, your big battle. This is the main source of conflict for this section of the dungeon. If it's a dragon's lair, this is the dragon. Room 4 is your dragon. Last one, room 5, is the reward, revelation, or plot twist, right? So if this is the treasure, maybe there's something in that treasure that's cursed and needs to be identified, or the curse needs to be removed, and that sets up the next adventure. Maybe it's a revelation. You find that the dragon is actually working for the lich. Plot twist. You find out the dragon is actually the person who sent you on this quest. The dragon likes to polymorph and mess with people, right? So it's the reward, the revelation, the plot twist. Ideally, room 5 is setting up the next part of your story. So that's how I think of the 5-room dungeon. It's explained here on John 4's website. You can also get his book for free, like I said. But this is not what I really want to focus on today. I just explained that as the setup, 5-room dungeon. That's what it is. This is a blog called Gnome Stew. And a few years back, he published a blog entry that showed 12 different layouts for the 5-room dungeon. But somebody in his comments pointed out that there was an academic article that broke down all the different patterns that you can take 5 nodes and put them into. So you can take 5 nodes, and there's a variety of different ways you can connect those 5 nodes. And in fact, this article, this academic article that's referenced here, shows that there's 21 different combinations for 5 nodes. So you've got 5 nodes, 5 connectors, and now this is a tool you can use to build your 5-room dungeons, or effectively a 10-room dungeon if you want to double that 5-room design and make each of the connectors its own encounter. So you could design your dungeon around 5 rooms, or 5 rooms with 5 different connectors, and that gives you effectively a 10-room dungeon, because we're not thinking of rooms as specific rooms, right? So if this is a forest, there's 5 different locations in this forest, and there's 5 different paths through the forest that connect these locations to each other. And you can see the white labeled locations and the brown labeled paths on this map. So you actually double your 5-room dungeon to make a forest with 10 encounters, 5 locations, and 5 paths. So you might have the Druid's Grove as one location and the Huntsman's Lodge as another location in this forest. But then you would have a connector. How do you get from the Druid's Grove to the Huntsman Lodge? Well, you have to get by the Grotto Path, right? So the Grotto Path becomes its own encounter. Even though it's a connector, the Grotto Path maybe is where a small group of goblins live, right? So this is a way to think about dungeon design using the 5-room design with these patterns of nodes and connectors. So now I want to go into Dungeon Scrawl, which is a software I've used before. You've probably seen it in a couple of my other videos. It's a simple software that you can use to draw dungeons. It's free. You can use it online. You don't have to download anything. I actually have the paid version for reasons, YouTube reasons, right? But so Dungeon Scrawl is going to let us kind of play around with this node design. I'm going to focus in on the Stingray layout. So in our 21 layouts, the Stingray, up here circled in red, is one of the layouts that I haven't used to make a dungeon yet. And if you see the Stingray, I put this little X on here to play around with to make it easier to show you what I'm doing, right? So the Stingray layout, you have 1 room, 2 room, 3 room, 4 room, and they're in this square shape. But then you have a connector here in the middle that connects room 1 and room 3. And then you have your 5th room that comes off of room 3, right? So it makes this Stingray pattern. But we're going to go into Dungeon Scrawl, and we're going to play around with that. So in Dungeon Scrawl, we are going to make our 4 rooms, right? Because this Stingray pattern is basically 4 rooms in a box shape, or square shape, right? So here are our 4 rudimentary rooms. And those rooms need a connector. Well, what do we usually use as connectors in dungeons? We use hallways. So here's a hallway, there's a hallway, there's a hallway, there's a hallway. And then to get our Stingray shape, we need the tail coming off here. This is another connector, and we need 1 more room, right? So this basically creates our Stingray shape. The only other thing about our Stingray shape is there's this connector in the middle that connects rooms 1 and 3. So we'll go back to Dungeon Scrawl, and we need to put a connector in here. So we could put just a hallway, right? Kind of zigzagging through the dungeon here, right? And maybe if we wanted to, we can make this hallway a secret passage, right? So we can put secret doors on either end of this kind of zigzag hallway. And now we've completed our Stingray node design. It looks kind of rudimentary. It looks pretty basic. If we want to get fancy with it, we could throw it into isometric view, right? And then it looks a little cooler this way, but it's not overly exciting or interesting. I don't know how much this really inspires ideas. But we've got a secret passage down the middle. Maybe this is plenty good enough for what you need it to be. So we don't have to think of every node as a room, and we don't have to think of every connector as a hallway, right? So this is where we can start to get a little creative with this 5-room dungeon design to make it a little more interesting and maybe a little more playable than just 5 simple rooms. So through the magic of editing, I just labeled those rooms real quick, and now we can see this is our Stingray pattern, right, laid out as a dungeon. But now I want to make it a little more interesting. So I'm going to slide over here, and I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to start the same way, actually. So I'm going to start with a room, just like we did over there. So here's our room 1. So let's grab number 1. There's room 1. So we're going to be similar, but we're starting to think about nodes and connectors as more than just rooms and hallways. So my connector off of room 1, instead of a hallway, I'm going to make it a stairwell. And so now I'm going to put room 2, which this isn't a big leap in imagination, right? We're still using the same pattern that we have over here with room 1 and room 2, right? All we've done is replace this hallway right here with a stairwell here. So we're not getting overly creative. The other thing we can do here is we can make our room 4, and our room 4 can be right next to room 2. So our connector between room 2 and room 4 is simply a door. So like I said, we don't have to think of every connector as a hallway. It could be simply a door from one room to the next. So now we've got our room 4, and we still need our room 3. And this is where we might get a little more creative. So let's say, because I want to play around with the verticality of this dungeon. Let's say room 3 is all the way down here on a 3rd level of the dungeon. And we're going to put like a landing so that this stairwell can go down 2 flights. So here's our connector from room 1 to room 3. Grab our number 3 to label this. There we go. So room 1 and room 3 are still connected, but this connector between 1 and 3 is a little more interesting because now it's a stairwell with a landing in the middle of it. And that landing might create a whole nother encounter. But we do need a way for room 1 to be connected to room 4. Over here we use a secret passage. And we could still do that if we wanted to. If this secret passage is also a stairwell, we'll take our secret passage and we'll have a secret passage here that connects room 1. Now the other part of this node design is if we look over here, room 4 is supposed to connect to room 3. So we could also make that a part of our secret passage network here. And then we now have a secret passage here. So 3 is connected to 4, right, by this same stairwell. These set of stairs over here that connect 1 to 3 also connects 3 to 4. And we've accomplished connecting 4 to 1, right? So now we have a little more interesting design because we have this intersection of our connectors, right? So we've kind of deviated a little bit from the straightforward concept, but we're still accomplishing all the same things. 1 is still connected to 3, 1 is still connected to 4, 4 is still connected to 3. We've just done it in a more interesting way, and that could give us far more interesting ideas for our encounters in this 5-room dungeon. Lastly, we need our 5th room, so I'm going to add another stairwell here, coming off of room 4, and this is going down to room 5. Now, the other thing about room 5 is because we've done these different levels, room 5 is now on the same level of the dungeon as room 3. So could we get creative and make this a little more dynamic and deviate from our node pattern, and we could put another secret passage between room 3 and room 5. So we've essentially accomplished the same thing as the node pattern suggested here, but we've created far more interesting dungeon layout, and we've kind of added an extra connector to create more of a loop in this dungeon. And if the players are smart enough to find these secret passages, then this dungeon becomes far more dynamic. But we still started with a simple node pattern, the Stingray node pattern here, and then it inspired something fairly interesting for only 5 rooms. So now you can see I've done this with all 7 of these top patterns. So I've done the star pattern here, the arrow pattern here. What's interesting about this one is my connector. See, like the arrow pattern has a connector between what would be room 4 and room 5, right? So I've done that here. So here's what would be room 4 of this arrow pattern, and here's room 5 of this arrow pattern. But instead of the connector being a stairwell or a hallway or a door, I made it this double hallway here that you can see. This double hallway could be a cool trap encounter where maybe there's something at the end of this hallway here, like a statue that comes to life or a boulder that rolls towards them, right? So you have this double hallway here, which could make an interesting encounter. And now we have the cricket pattern. And what I did here was make a stairwell that basically functions as these 3 connectors up here. So you see how the top 3 rooms, right? Room 1, 2, and 3, these top 3 rooms are these 3 rooms here, here, and here. But instead of having 3 different connectors that allow all 3 of these rooms to interact here, right? I created one stairwell with a landing in the middle that basically functions as these 3 connectors over here. Next, we have the path. And if you look at the path here as it's mapped out in these nodes, this is basically Matt Colville's Delian Tomb. His Delian Tomb follows the path pattern, right? So I've taken that and just, because the path pattern is pretty linear, right? Like the path, basically you have to go from room 1 to room 2 to room 3, room 4, room 5. You get it, right? So I've done that. So we still have room 1, room 2, room 3, and room 4, and then room 5. So it's still that linear path of these nodes. However, to make it a little more interesting, I inserted a secret passage right here between rooms 1 and 4, and then I made the connector between room 4 and room 5. I made this a hallway with arrow slits in this wall, right? So that makes a more interesting challenge, effectively making this connector right here, a part of our path, that connector, an encounter of its own. So this would actually become 6 encounters, right? Because you're taking one of your connectors and making it an encounter. But we're still technically using this path pattern. We've just spiced it up a little bit. Next, we have the bull pattern. So again, this is following the same format. You still have, the 2 rooms at the top, which are kind of the horns of the bull, right? That's these 2 rooms here. And then those connect to the next 2 rooms, right? But those are also connected to this 5th room down here. So these 3 rooms that are kind of the face of the bull are all connected there. The only thing I've done is I've used, as a connector, I used a small room that would basically be connecting room 4 and room 5. So this part of the bull pattern right here is this extra room that I put in. Instead of a hallway or a stairwell, it's an extra little room. It could be just an empty, dusty room in your dungeon that allows for a downbeat where the characters can pause and maybe roleplay, or it could be, again, a 6th encounter to your 5-room dungeon. So while this wasn't a complete deep dive, I think I dug deep enough to get your creative juices flowing and help you see that there's a lot you can do with this 5-room dungeon design. And it's not merely a 5-step process to create a one-shot adventure. It's actually a mindset that you can get into that helps you cover your bases and include all the different aspects of gameplay into your dungeon, and then tie it together with an interesting theme or story that then motivates players from this dungeon to the next dungeon. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time in the Dire Den. And here's my Everything's a Dungeon video and my 6-room dungeon design that I mentioned in the beginning.